So it's great to be here. I can't think of anything more important for our country, for the world today, than reliable power. And knowing many of you in the room, I know it's in very good hands in South Carolina. Certainly lots of challenges there, lots of opportunities. We're moving toward nuclear. China is still building 100 coal plants a year, so go figure out how that works in global warming. So I'll introduce Walter in a second. I was reminded the other day on CNBC that this month is the 5-year anniversary of COVID. Think about that, 5 years. We learned about COVID in March of 2020. This is a picture of me in Taiwan visiting one of our customers. We had to bag our trip. I used to go right after Chinese New Year. We had to bag our trip to Shanghai because the Chinese said something weird's going on here. We're all getting sick. So we didn't, but I kept the trip. So I'm in Taipei, and we had this board, and what you'll see here are two things. Number one, it says Barbara Melvin was with me. We decided she couldn't go because we didn't know that we both could get sick. And the second thing, this is the first time I was ever given a mask. I went to their office, first thing, put the mask on, and then they took us to dinner. Try eating dinner with a mask. It is absolutely not any fun. But what I will remind you, we're certainly in uncertain times, but the stock market, our 401ks are becoming 201ks right now, so this week, but the stock market dropped 10% right after COVID. So these things happen in life, and I think we should be reminded of that. So I like to play videos at first, so maybe I'm going to show the next video. It's from my favorite movie, Animal House, and maybe this encapsulates where we are today, and hopefully we're not going to where it ends up. So Kimo, if you would sort of cue that up, I would appreciate it.
Remain calm! All is well! All is well! Remain...
So I don't think that's where we're going to end up here. That's the good news of today's presentation, and I think we'll show you that. So it's a privilege to be here today with a good friend of mine, Walter Kemmsies. Walter is probably the best economist that I know. He's a PhD economist that specializes in supply chain. We always say the best economist is the one-handed economist, so they can't keep saying on the other hand, right? But the thing I like about Walter is that he really distills things into stuff that we all can understand. And so it's great to be here. We have a mutual client, North Point Development in Savannah. That's a shameless plug for a horizontal real estate developer that does a lot of work in South Carolina. And if we've met you, one of our first questions is how much power can we have, right? I mean, that's just the normal question that we get. So it's great to be here today. We're going to have some fun with this. A lot of slides, but hopefully we will leave some time for discussion, so please have some questions. And Walter, good to be with you.
All right, that's great. So rarely do I get the occasion, only 3 or 4 times that we've been able to work together. I learned a lot from Jim. I came from Wall Street before I joined the port industry, so I lived in the UK, did a lot of CNBC, that macro global stuff, and then I joined the port industry, and from that top-down perspective, I had to learn how to look at the world bottom-up. And one of the things that got beaten into me, by people like Jim, was this is about supply. Oh, yeah, thanks. It's about supply. We are a cost to the rest of the industry, so if you want to get more volume, if you want to grow more, you've got to be more efficient. If you don't have a good operation, if you don't meet the 3 C's, cost, consistency, and capacity, then it doesn't work. So I learned a lot, but I still kind of talk from both directions, from the top down to bottom up, and hopefully what you're going to hear from us is going to help you think about, your vision, your strategy, and how do you integrate all of these themes. And they're not that disparate. I think by the time we're done this morning, it'll be a little clear to you that they all kind of come together. We're still growing, and we're going to change the way we are. And let's think about that. So I have a couple comments here first before we really get into a lot of nitty-gritty. The first is we're going to look at the short term briefly, just where are we. Jim's point about us coming out of COVID it's been 5 years, but for a lot of people, it's still yesterday. A lot of people still working from home and, still fighting to continue to work from home, but because they want to, not because they're afraid of going into the office. I mean, if that were true, we wouldn't have so many people in the airports and in the airlines. So travel is back, everything's back. The last thing that hasn't got there yet is, people, working, at the office. But it doesn't change the fact that it's still a very unstable world. We've helped Russia after they got through perestroika get a little more developed, but unfortunately, making a country more prosperous doesn't mean that it becomes politically any better. We did the same thing for China, and those are places that we have to watch these days. They're troublemakers, but we are reacting. We're changing the way we do our supply chains. And so I have a word here. It says VUCA strategy, and that's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. You always need a VUCA strategy, almost any year, any time. But these days, it's still, it's the thought process you need more than ever. And we'll walk through a little bit about how to think about these things, what possible scenarios there are, but we also don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's some very good trends that give us some strong economic growth, some health. And GDP growth, if it weren't for all of the changes with the public sector policy, cutting down government employment, government spending, pulling away from trading with certain partners, some of which treated us well, some not so well. The view has to be a GDP growth of around 2%. And we can justify that forecast 20 different ways, but it would be about 2%. And inflation higher than the Fed wants. We're looking at 2.5% to 3%, and that's assuming the Fed is vigilant and remains independent. There's always political pressure from both parties to, kowtow and make interest rate policy, help them get reelected, and that doesn't work. It didn't help Jimmy Carter when he put Paul Volcker in 1978, and it hasn't helped any president since. The Fed stands very independent. So what the Fed doesn't seem to understand is it's not the 1970s. They're struggling a bit with their interest rate policy. They would like to get interest rates down, but they think inflation is quote unquote stubborn at 2.5% to 3%. It's stubborn because of the labor market. We're not making more workers very fast. The working age population's forecast to grow 0.2%. So we'll go through that and why that matters, why it says inflation could be higher. There's a growing risk of recession. Economists' consensus view now is 40% risk of a recession in the next 12 months. And it only takes a few words from the White House and that 40% disappears and it goes to zero. So we're very dependent on what we hear coming out of the White House these days and the leadership in the House. So the reason for focusing on that quite a bit is for the business cycle, we have to look at employment very carefully. Inflation, of course. Companies are getting a little concerned about what's the right way to invest. Do we continue to build our international supply chain? Do we try to build more domestic supply chain? So that's the kind of uncertainty that can impact growth and make it either higher or lower than what we have here. So as we think about that, that's more of a medium-term thing. We need to take into consideration more of the longer-term issues that are impacting our growth. And what are these? Well, we could make a really long list. I put 5 bullets there, and I was afraid to put a few more because I think Jim would have got the razor blade and said, "Come on, we don't have all day. We got to get this done, in a reasonable amount of time." So we're going to talk a little bit about the trade policies, the population growth rate. I'm going to make some rude comments about automation. I'm sorry, I'm not a big fan of the press. All I get from them is bad news, not always correct news, and then a lot of science fiction. Automation sounds great, but we're a good 10, 20 years away before we get to, that Star Trek kind of stuff that people think is taking place in the warehouses. We're getting there, but oh my goodness, let's not rush this. So why do we care? Because if we don't get automation, it's going to be hard to achieve a lot of our goals. We just need much higher productivity, because if labor is more productive, then you can pay them higher rates without it affecting profits. But if labor isn't becoming more profit, you can't give them raises. Sorry, but if the companies aren't in business, it's just not going to work. So those are the key things here. Jim will interrupt me a lot because I stole a few of his slides and stuck it in mine.
Yeah, we don't coordinate these presentations, but we kind of come at it from different angles. But he did take one, but that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like, that was a good idea. I was like, can I find a better way to say it? No, I can't. I'll just steal it. Now, what the heck? So as long as we let the other guy know that we did it, we're okay. So this chart here is important to you for several reasons. One of them, all right, so this shows you construction of new manufacturing capacity in the United States. It's a monthly number that's been annualized, and so we had this nice rate from 2015 to 2021 of about $6 billion a month, which doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot. You're starting construction and manufacturing, and it's a good rate. And then we passed the Infrastructure Investment for Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. The names mean absolutely nothing in terms of what they actually do. What they are is a lot of money to get companies to build manufacturing in the US. And of that huge surge from about $6 billion a month, kind of average, we shot all the way up to $21 billion. So more than threefold. So 3.5 times the rate that we were running at before. So if you don't believe in America becoming more of a manufacturing-oriented economy, you are fighting some serious data here. It's happening. Now, when you look at that surge, and I'm going to say this before Jim does, but about 2/3 of that is going to be electric vehicles and batteries. And the last administration went a little over their skis, and they pushed us a little too far, a little too fast. I worked for Georgia DOT a couple of years ago on the 50-year freight transportation plan, and we have to factor in electric vehicles, and we weren't really sure what to do with it that much because there's just way too many problems. Those chargers, they don't work. Only 2/3 of the time do they work. 1/3 of the time they don't. Do we have enough of them? What happens to apartment buildings where people don't have a garage? How do you charge them for recharging their cars? These guys don't pay gasoline tax, so how do you cover their wear and tear? Yeah, I'm not such a big fan of the electric vehicles, but we are going in that direction. And so 2/3 of that is our kind of Biden things. 1/3 of that is America things that the country needs. And I'll come back to this point in a little bit.
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is the ultimate misnomer.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it created a huge amount of inflation. But anyway, that's what's in a name, right? I mean, it's...
Well, yeah, I'm going to go cheat and just jump ahead a slide or two here. But this is my inflation slide. Sorry if you have to avert your eyes. I know it's not pretty. But I'm going to say something about it because you have to. That black line is the Consumer Price Index. It's the inflation rate. It's a year-on-year calculation. The black line in 2022 peaked out at just below 10%, and then it's been coming down. And this all happened, that surge happened at the same time that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. So it's our sarcasm about why didn't you just call it, something else, like a Manufacturing Act? Why Inflation Reduction Act? Because when you look at the labor markets, all this did, and if you look carefully at that red line, the red line, and I've got two circles around it, that's wage growth in America. So after the horrible Bernanke bomb of 2007 or 2009, you remember those great economic times where people were losing their homes. We stimulated the economy, and we were struggling not to end up like Japan. During the 2012-2019 period, we had periods where inflation was negative. And wage growth was very low, 2%. And we hit COVID into some pop-up. It climbed at one point to 8%, but it's been averaging now for well over a year, 4%. So we're going to come back to that point. But one of the things the Inflation Reduction Act did is it created a lot of jobs very quickly, and we didn't have enough trained people to be able to fill those jobs. wages started to grow faster, and one of the biggest drivers of inflation is costs. And that's why you see this chart. The yellow line tells you what the truck transportation costs have been, and that's a big contributor to cost. Washington figured that out in 2023, all right, way too late. Now, that's when Biden created this flow program, and supply chains matter. Well, thanks for telling us that. We imports never would have figured that out. So the truck rates have come down. We've been more careful with supporting the truck industry. More should be done. Commodity prices came down, so inflation has dropped off the 9% level. But as you can see in the far right of that chart, the kindling is there for more inflation. So it's very unlikely that the Fed's going to get back to the 2% target that they've dreamed of. So anyways, what could help them, though, is the reduction in government employment. I'm not going to dwell on this chart here. I stole this from another publication. It's from the government. It's where the government employees are concentrated, and there's a tendency to think they all live around the Beltway, or the swamp, depending on your political bent and how you refer to this. Yeah, there are quite a few there, but they are in the rest of the area. We want to be mindful of where they are in the southeast. Georgia has, a lot more than, and these are civilians. These are not the military base, and so there's quite a few in Georgia. South Carolina has some too, and this is something to bear in the back of your mind: is what are we going to do with these folks when, half of them or more lose their jobs? So this is one of the reasons that economists have started to feel a little concerned about recessions. I am not for our area, and I mean the Southeast, because we're building a lot of things. We're going to build more things. We're very pro-manufacturing America, and that helps us. So let me see. By the way, you can have these slides. Just ask the organizers. Anybody, and they'll be happy to share them with you. And these charts that say FRED on them, that's Federal Reserve Economic Development. If you right-click on them and press Control, it'll open up the website with that exact chart, the data. You can update it, you can change it, you can play with it. All right, so our presentation empowers you. So supply chains, where are they? They've stabilized. The inventory to sales ratio has been dropping for the better part of 30 years. And that's because our transportation industry has become more and more efficient, more capacity, lower costs because you can do more with less, and more consistency. Now, on the liner side, when we import our stuff, that's a different story. I'm not going to go there because, Jim has far more of a background. But the key thing here is we've got our inventory to sales ratio. How many dollars of goods do we have to hold to support $1 of sales? Roughly where we wanted, about $1.30 of inventories to sales for the retailers. So that's very stable. You can see it dropped a lot during COVID, and it shot back up as we overstocked and slowly worked our way down. So it looks stable. Corporate America has done a good job. Thanks to Biden, despite Biden, thanks to Trump, despite Trump, yeah, I don't know how much the politicians matter. America's corporate sector remains strong, the markets work, and that's what gives me some confidence in the economic outlook for the country. In terms of bringing things in, the ocean carrier rates have been all over the place. They've been declining, over the last 3 months, and I still think they're a little high. I think they're going to drop quite a bit more. The ocean carriers built, I think, too many ships, and I'll pester Jim about it if he doesn't talk about it during his part here. All right, so we talked about the inflation. The truck rates are not killing us anymore. The ocean carrier rates aren't killing us. Labor costs are still growing at 4%, but a lot of that drive for inflation is going away, but it remains concentrated on labor, and that's not something you can ignore. All right, so labor is changing. We'll come back to that. I want to talk a little bit about our trade policy. So China, the data only goes back to 2003. This is not value data, and economists love to talk about value data. And I walked off Wall Street in 2006, joined the port industry, and I did my first charts like you do on CNBC with the value of trade and how the value of trade was going to go through a port. And the Then we took a break, and the port director pulled me aside and said, "Ooh, do we get paid for the value of the trade, or do we get paid by the volume of trade? You know, like we get paid so much per box. It doesn't kind of matter to us what's in there." I go, "Oh, okay. Then why the hell are you talking about the value of trade?" "Oh, that's what we did on TV, you know, on CNBC for the investors." He goes, "Well, that's fine, but not here." So this is volume, okay? And you'll see charts with value and TV. Ignore that. China's share was very low before 2000. They joined the WTO. It shot up and up and up and up. Everybody said China was never going to make it. They didn't have factories. They didn't have electric networks. They didn't have anything. And yet, by 2007, China was at a 37% share of our containerized imports. And that's the high-value stuff. And they stayed there for a long time, but it started to come off the boil, and not because of any government effort. You know, there was no Trump in office back then. It was Obama. And then, you know, Trump came in, but not much had changed until 2018. And the reason we saw China get stuck there is their wage costs went up so much that jobs started to migrate to Vietnam, India, and other places with cheaper labor. So you see at the bottom, India and Vietnam, their share sneaking up. And once Trump was in office in 2018, he said, that's it. January 1st, 2019, we're going to impose tariffs on 3/4 of the stuff we get from China. The other 1/4, we needed it, so we had to be nice to them. The share rose a little bit to 37%, and then come 2019, it just dropped a lot. In the last year, in 2023, it dropped to 29%. Last year, it went up a little bit because everybody's rushing stuff out of China because they knew that once Trump was in office, the tariffs were coming. And so they did. And what the forecast that I have for this off my quantitative model is China is going to end up like Japan. Japan went from 24% to 12% after Reagan slapped 100% tariffs on their goods in 1987. And it looks exactly the same for China. Chinese companies are doing the same as the Japanese companies. They started to move their final assembly into Mexico, into the US. The Japanese guys, when they got tariffed, they moved it to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea. And then they shipped their final goods from there to the US with really low tariffs. Well, what the Chinese companies are doing, not the government, the companies are trying to do final assembly in the US and in Mexico, in Vietnam, not so much in India because China and India are mortal enemies and they will remain mortal enemies forever. There's a water war between them. But all the other countries are benefiting from this. Now, can this really work? Can we really see more of a shift? Well, we'll see. There's a lot of stuff related to what goes on in the ocean. I'm going to, if Jim wasn't here, I'd say stuff that Jim would say, but since Jim is here, Jim will say what he would say. So we'll wait for the good part. I just put this in here. This is for your reading pleasure. It's simply this tariff that we're going to impose on the Chinese goods is not everything that we're going to do. We're going to do non-tariff barriers to China as well. Their stuff is going to be subject to several inspections. We have $1 billion of Chinese goods sitting in ports waiting to be proven that it doesn't come from forced labor areas like Xinjiang province. The other thing is any ship made in China, the proposal from the trade representative is to slap a fee on them. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but I've seen a lot of stupid analysis. The reality is if all of those fees were put in place and you get some basic numbers, it's over $500 a 20-foot container. It would be a really expensive proposition. So that would be another reason not to expect the U.S. to strongly import stuff from China on Chinese-made vessels. But good luck with that, because ask Jim, he'll tell you what the story is with the manufacturers. So on the tariffs, I'm not going to give you answers. That'd be stupid. I give you an answer today, and then later on today, we get another announcement out of the White House. We're no longer going to tariff anybody. And then come Monday, we're going to tariff everybody twice as much as we said before. So
Well, you just went to your CEO last year and said, hey, I'm offshoring to Mexico instead of China.
Yeah, exactly.
And now you have a 25 or 50% tariff overnight. So, I mean, it changes by the minute, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. And so these are the questions you should ask. And by the way, if you put a 10% tariff on China and then the dollar revalues by 10% against Chinese renminbi, guess what the effect of the tariff is? Zero, exactly. So you got to watch the currency markets. I put a little chart there, the trade-weighted dollar. Up until Trump really got belligerent, the dollar was appreciating against all of the trading currencies that for our trading partners. It's come down a bit because they're a little worried about some volatility there. But these are the questions you need to ask. What will happen to foreign exchange rates? And if we don't get stuff from China, where would we get it from? So here's a statistic for you, and it rarely does it happen this way, but this is true. 80% of the goods that we import from China, China has a 20% market share. And 20% of the goods we get from China, China has an 80% market share. So not everything from China, if you tariff it, we just go to Turkey or Indonesia, or we'll go to, whatever. We don't have to bring it in from China. But for that last 20%, that's going to be tricky. Now, the West Coast guys, they're biting their nails because if we don't get stuff from China, where do we get it from? Well, someplace else in the world. And I want to show you here, this is from the United Nations. They measure port global connectivity. And you look carefully at this, and the lower the number means the higher you are in the ranking globally. There's 960 ports globally that they rank. And New York, New Jersey is the 37th most connected in the world. Savannah's at 45, Norfolk 53, Charleston's 59. Those ports change places depending on where you are and how the liners set up their services. So that was the last report. Before then, we've seen Charleston at number 2 in the past. So what I'd like you to see is that compare it to the West Coast, Long Beach, Los Angeles, Oakland, et cetera. They're much lower ranked. And it's never the case that the West Coast ports are more connected than the East Coast ports. So if you don't bring stuff in from Eastern Asia and you're going to go to Western Asia, it's coming here. And you saw in that previous chart that if you look at the bottom, India and Vietnam, most of which comes through the Red Sea, while during normal times otherwise around Cape Good Hope, it comes over to the southeast. It's a great time to be a southeast port, but it's not going to be very quick. So here's a chart on Chinese infrastructure, and I always get nervous doing this around Jim because he knows a little bit more about ports than I do. Kind of ran one in a liner. But this is the number of terminals that can handle the big ships, the 14,000s that we've set the East Coast up to be able to handle well. And that's how many terminals in all of the other Asian countries, excluding Japan and Korea, that can do the same. It's going to take a long time for these alternatives to China to have the infrastructure, not just on the water side, but on the land side to get there. So this is not an overnight thing. You can't rush it. But the trend is our friend, especially in the southeast. What's going on in Panama? I just worked for them last year. We did a 25-year development plan. So I spent way too much time thinking about these terminals. But there's 2 there that you see. In the north side, which would be the Caribbean, is Cristobal. And then the bottom is Balboa, down by Panama City. Those 2 belong to Hutchison. And they are selling those 2 and another 21 terminals to a combination of MSC, the world's largest ocean carrier, and BlackRock, the U.S.'s largest investment fund. They bought Global Infrastructure Partners, and this is part of their big investment into infrastructure. It took Wall Street a long time to understand that infrastructure is a great place to invest. I got there first 20 years ago. But by accident, I wasn't that smart. But you're going to see more and more money coming into infrastructure and freight movement. I think Wall Street finally woke up to the fact that this is what makes things move. So now we're going to switch to people a little bit. I was going to include some charts in energy, and then I thought, I'm not going to get in front of people who know a lot more about energy than I do and start telling them about energy, so I left that out. But energy is a key issue, and I'll leave it to Jim to comment on that. But I do look at population a lot, so looking at it globally, it's not looking pretty. 20 years ago, I was still on Wall Street, and I said some crappy things about the outlook, and I said that the United Nations was full of baloney. We'd never get to 9 billion people by 2050. And I continue to believe that. When you look at these charts like this is the number of children per family, per couple. The US, Mexico, everybody, the only exception there kind of is India is sitting at 2, but everybody's below 2.2, which is mathematically, given the fertility and mortality rates, what you need in order to maintain your population. None of these characters are there. And if you look around the world, countries are losing population, because the more we urbanize, the slower the population growth rate. And here's how to think of it. People in rural areas, they have another kid, throw them in bed with the other kids. They have public school, they get public health, and when they come home from school, make them work on the farm, and if enough of them live, it's your Social Security. Children are an asset. You live in an urban area and you have a kid, oh dear, you need a new bedroom. The house has to have another bedroom for the kid. You're gonna buy them a car. They're gonna need probably braces. And if they're going to go to college, when you go on the interview, you got to give them a nose job, because being smart isn't good enough anymore. You got to be smart and good looking. And if you're in Los Angeles, the net present value of a child is minus $1.4 million. It is very expensive to have a child. Children are a liability if you're in an urban area. And that's not just true in the US, it's global. Look at this. So I don't think we're going to get to 9 billion people by 2050. And I may not be around to be able to say, see, I was right, but it doesn't matter. So the population is an issue. In the US, working age population is going to grow at 0.2%. This is including rosy immigration assumptions, so it may be lower, but at 0.2% for the next 10 years. So if you're having trouble finding labor, it's only going to be more difficult. This means it's going to be hard to produce stuff in the United States. We're going to have to use a lot of automation, and the automation needs to mature very quickly. I mean, as long as I can drive through parts of Savannah where I live and the phone signal goes out, I don't want autonomous trucks, and I worry about all the autonomous equipment. But here, the red line is the number of job openings. The blue line is the number of unemployed people looking for work. It's government data. I almost work for this agency. The data is not perfect. I know the people who work on this. They work very hard, but it ain't perfect. But it does tell you something. We don't have a big spread between the red line and the blue line. There's still more openings than there are people looking for work. And this is why wages are growing faster than that 2% rate. It's why the Fed is under pressure, because they can't get inflation down to 2%. They're going to have to live with that. And how do they live with it? It's more productivity. More productivity is more automation, is more energy. So this slide I stole from Jim, and when Jim's not looking, I use it. But if I'm sitting with Jim, I'm just going to skip right through it, because
we talk about that, yeah.
Exactly. So I'm going to stop here. You heard what I had to say. The economy is likely to continue to grow, but the White House can put an end to that. Fire too many people too quickly, cut the spend too quickly, and you'll destabilize things, and that could be dangerous for the economic outlook. If it is a recession, it's not a Trump session, but the concern is Trump-pression, meaning Trump depression. These things can last quite some time. But hopefully the private sector can really rise to the occasion. We'll see. We continue to love real estate near ports. And even though we're going to try to manufacture more in the US, you can't produce a 100% American-made product. You can't in Europe, you can't here, you can't even in China. Everybody acts like China. Oh, the Apple iPhones are made in China. They're not. They're assembled there. The components come from 40 different countries, maybe even more. The world is globalized. You can be anti-global all you want. It's too late. Sorry, buddy, but we've globalized. And so it's also tricky for us. We may do more final assembly here, but you're still going to have to bring stuff in from abroad. E-commerce is another reason to like real estate in your ports. It looks good. So I think the U.S. is going to be okay, but if you want better than the tepid numbers for the U.S., I moved to the Southeast like I did in 2018. I almost got fired for it. I worked for Jones Lang LaSalle, and my boss said, your career here isn't very long-lived. And he was right. I quit. So anyways, let me pass it on to Jim. There's a lot more to think about, and we really need to focus on matters here.
One thing I'd say is a start here, and I'm going to cover 5 or 6 points real quickly, but what's happening right now, President Trump said all of this when he was running for office. There's no real surprise in the policies that are being articulated. In fact, you go back 30 years, he talked about tariffs. You read Navarro, you listen to Peter Navarro, you read Robert Lighthizer book, they talk about tariffs. So I think the key question is, are the tariffs a negotiating tool or are they a revenue source? I think if they're a negotiating tool, they're a good thing. If you think they're a revenue source, I think that's a lousy idea. So we'll get into that a little bit. The global economy is quite interesting. So for the first time in 2024, the world GDP exceeded $100 trillion. And what you see here clearly is what we know, Asia has become the manufacturing center of the world in the last 30 years. And half of that 36 trillion in Asia is China, about what's made in China. But if you look at the expansiveness of China in terms of their investment in Africa, investment in Latin America, they're way more dominant than that. And then North America's 33, and Europe has just been steadily losing relevance over time. And I think, frankly, that will continue. And then even more telling, the top 15 world economies are 80% of GDP. So it's the 80-20 rule. And if you look at US and China, almost 45% of the world GDP. So what's the key message here? The US and China have got to find a way to coexist. Even though we have tremendous philosophical differences, we're never going to see political, economic systems the same way. Got to find a way to coexist. And what's interesting is all the places, Mexico, India, all these up-and-coming places, they're still far away. And I probably disagree with Walter a little bit. I don't think we should write China off as quickly as maybe people are. China spent 30 years building infrastructure that is really, really relevant. And you see every time there's a demand spike, where's the stuff made? It goes back to China because they've got the capacity to scale very quickly. So I think this is an interesting chart of the haves. Brazil is one they said Brazil has potential and it always will. Just as great resources has just never really made the economic impact that one would have thought it would. When you look at merchandise partners, and this is in value because it's the best way it is expressed, you see the disconnect a little bit between exports and imports. A couple of points. I mean, the main issue is China, obviously. That's 2022. That's when we were all at home in COVID. I mean, if we were here 3 years ago, we've been talking about port congestion. We wouldn't be talking about tariffs. We'd be talking about how do we overcome port congestion. Everybody was buying couches and everything they could do at home because they couldn't travel, right? So the imports from China boomed. So imports in 2022 were like 3 or 4 times more than exports. That's logical because of value of goods, number one. Anybody that tells you that we'll ever balance trade as the U.S. with anyone is wrong because our per capita income is like 3 or 4 times. I mean, we just consume more. There's no way you can balance trade with such disparities in per capita income. But China's the big disparity. Canada and Mexico, for all the noise about NAFTA and all this animus about Mexico and China and Canada today, the trade is actually reasonably balanced. It's intentionally so. That's what NAFTA did. That's what USMCA did. So that was the result that we were looking for. So really, half our trade is dominated by 3 countries. A lot of the rest is noise. I think NAFTA worked as planned. Mexico as an alternative, to Asia has been real, but it hasn't looked too good in the last 3 or 4 weeks because all of a sudden, we were in the Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference. There were people literally having trucks sitting at the border waiting. Do we bring them across? Do we not bring them across? Are we going to pay tariffs or not? It's that real time of an issue. China imports have come down after the peak consumption, but it's impossible to balance trade with China. And the theory of trade that I always embraced was David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which says that... Yes, sure.
On that chart of mine where I showed China's share was down, the volume is still higher than it was before. It's just that the volume grew faster in other places. So, to Jim's point here, it's not a trivial thing, trade with China.
And I mean, we import like 2.4 million TUs a month, and in August of last year, we had 1 million for the first time from China. So China's not going away. I think that's the important point. But theory of comparative advantage says you should manufacture where you're most able to do it. And the reality is we don't have the workforce to bring all this manufacturing back. Even if we wanted to, I mean, we just don't have the workforce, and we probably couldn't afford what was made and certainly on the retail side. So what's driving the tariffs? Well, Mexico and Canada, it's fentanyl and illegal immigration, more so for Mexico than Canada. Trump just hates Trudeau. I mean, I hate to say, he just hates Trudeau. I mean, it's just a hatred there, the different philosophy. Maybe with the new one, I don't know if it's going to be different. Again, China's the big issue, subsidized manufacturing, supply chain security, and I think just basic philosophy. They're not really free market people, we are. Europe is reciprocity. You may know this. If you buy a European imported car, it's 2.5% duty. We export a car to Europe, it's 10% duty. What's the logic of that? I mean, where does that come from in terms of logic? It makes no sense. And I think reality, Trump realizes the U.S. economy is stronger than anyone else in the world, and he thinks he can make use of that as a negotiator, and I hope that he does. But the question as to who pays tariffs is interesting. Walmart, you may have seen this week, said basically to all their Chinese suppliers, we expect you to eat the tariffs. We're not paying more. If you've ever done business with Walmart, you either do 0 or over 10 million. They don't buy 20,000. So Chinese suppliers are going to be very reluctant to lose Walmart as a customer. So these are the various issues, and it changes over time. So again, the imbalance is China. And by the way, just the tariffs should have an impact, right? Well, we got tariffs on China in 2018, as Walter said. There were $80 billion in tariffs paid on Chinese imports. Didn't drive inflation, didn't stop our economic growth at all. So you can question who really pays them. But in 2023, Mexico did pass China for the first time in terms of import value, which is pretty interesting, I think. We talk a lot about population. Walter showed what happened year over year. I don't think it's too surprising that people are moving within this country. But there's so my main theory is that supply chain infrastructure follows population. If you want to know where supply chain is going to grow, want to know where you need industrial real estate, you need power, follow population. In the University of Virginia, the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service does a great job in doing 30-year population projections. And what you see is what you probably know, the Southeast, the fastest growing in terms of absolute numbers. I don't use a lot of percentages because I find them misleading. 1 to 2 is 100%, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. Southeast is growing with the main center on Florida, almost 100 million people. Southwest is second, the main center on Texas, over 60 million people. The West, they say, is growing. I dispute that. I think that California is not going to grow in the way that they say it is. I mean, the In-N-Out Burger is moving their headquarters from California to Texas. Who would have ever thought, right? I mean, so I think California is over-predicted to grow. And obviously the Midwest and the Northeast not growing. And a friend of ours, Michael Randall, had a statistic that 60 years ago, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the South were all 60 million people. Today, the Northeast and the Midwest are roughly 60 million people. The South is over 120 million people. So air conditioning, cheap land, quality of life, things of that nature had a great impact on the growth of the South, and that will continue. And then 13 states in the next 30 years will grow by over 1 million people. And most of those, you see where they are. They're in the South. There's some in the West. South Carolina is certainly on there. I mean, you see the statistics. We're the fastest growing state. That's in percentage terms. And then within this is some interesting things of the age of the population. So Texas is a relatively young population, like 12% are over 65. South Carolina is 22% over 65. But that's not necessarily bad because the average per capita income of people coming into South Carolina is $110,000 a year. People leaving is $60,000 a year. So all the baby boomers like me are going to spend their money so they don't have to give it to their kids, right? So that's good. That's good for consumption in this region. So I think, again, this is stuff, and these 13 states will be bigger than the balance of 37 states in 30 years' time, which is quite telling. So supply chain will follow this population shift. And these are the states you would think that's a pretty typical readout to that. And then what's interesting, this is so in these clusters are over 50% of the U.S. population. So I think 52% of the U.S. population is in these clusters. So again, if you want to know where the supply chain is moving, it's to serve these areas because we want to do last mile delivery. E-commerce has grown from 15 to 30%. Lots of change here. So again, and what's interesting about the Southeast is we have two major ports in small towns, Savannah and Charleston, that aren't serving local hinterlands, really. The cargo has to go into this arc between sort of Birmingham, Atlanta, Raleigh, Nashville. That's 30 million. Each of those clusters, the red, the blue, and the yellow, is about 35 million people. So again, that's where the industrial growth is going to be, is serving those markets. So these population trends, I think, are interesting.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah.
So, I do this kind of work and development, et cetera, all over the country. And the states that are not showing up in the area, development magazine survey, the best states to do business and all that. So I've been called by a number of them. They go, "You live in Georgia?" I go, "Yeah." "Georgia did pretty good." "Yep." "Do you know why Georgia did pretty good?" "Yep, I've been there long enough. I've been working there long enough." They go, "Good. Could you come over here and help us do the same thing?" So I couldn't because of various reasons, but the key thing is it's more than one state. It's gone, wait a minute, those Southern guys, sneaky people, what's in their water? We got to put it in ours. So we say these things, but we're assuming that the South doesn't lose focus. It's going to get more competitive. There was no target on our back. Now there is a target on our back.
And what's also, if I can go back, what's also interesting in this green, it's not just one city. I mean, these are 15 or 20 cities, Birmingham. Knoxville, Tennessee, there's no Rocky Top embedded in this presentation, by the way. Tennessee guy, so I won't torture you to that. Knoxville, Tennessee, a downtown condo is $700 a square foot. That's unheard of. I mean, that is unheard of in a sleepy town. So there's multiple cities. It's not just dependent on one area. We had a lot of noise about my dear friends at the International Longshoremen's Association. They got a 63% wage increase over 6 years. That's pretty good. They make $65 an hour at the end of 6 years for largely unskilled labor. It is a high-wage industry. That's just the way it is. Most U.S. industry is high wage when you compare it to the world. I mean, it's not unusual. Automation everybody's talked about automation in ports. It's really not going to happen to a wholesale extent, certainly not in this country, because the management has agreed with the union not to fully automate. They've only agreed to semi-automation. So this is a lot of noisy time, but for the next 6 years, we should have relative labor peace. And the good news for us is ports will not be a constraint as far as supply chain growth in the South. There are 4 ports in the U.S., probably investing about $10 billion over the next 20 or 30 years, all in the South. Houston, Savannah, Charleston, and Norfolk. New York cannot grow. L.A. cannot grow. They're finished. The other North Point in Kansas City wants to build a port in Oregon. Good luck with that. There's nobody that lives there. It's not going to be very successful. So anyway. And then the top 10 ports in the U.S. do about 85% of the volume, and that, like every other industry, is increasing. There's some labor tension in the Southeast with the ILA and the state-run ports. I won't go too much into that. That's a topic for several glasses of wine, really, and it's complicated, but it's an issue to be concerned about. Container shipping, going forward, it's about big ships. Walter mentioned the China shipbuilding thing, 70% of the ships on order are being built in China now. You want to bring all the shipbuilding back to the U.S.? Good luck with that. The biggest shipyard in the United States is in Wisconsin. So bringing an 18,000 TEU container ship somehow through the lake system up to the St. Lawrence, I don't even know how that works, but it's not going to be very successful.
No, I did some work with the Heritage Foundation, and it was horribly depressing. We really found no options really for expansion. It's going to take an act of Trump if we're going to change that.
It'll never happen. It's not even a laudable goal. The shipping lines operate in alliances. Those are changing, but the major message is that the big ships are here to stay, 16 to 17,000 TEU ships. And this decision by shipping lines to build big ships created an emergency for ports. When I joined the port, we couldn't work these ships. We had to spend $2 billion just to get ready to handle these ships, and fortunately, we're able to do it today. Like in the auto industry, there's a debate about the fuel of the future. What is it? Nobody knows. There's a mandate to have zero-emission shipping by 2050. These are the choices: dual fuel LNG, that's what's being built now, bioethanol or ammonia, or I think the long-term solution is probably hydrogen. But one thing to note, all of these alternatives are more expensive. So shippers pay fuel factors, they pay fuel charges. So they want all these alternatives, but when they get the bill, the procurement people are probably not going to be very happy with it. But that day is coming, and it's real. So since COVID, I would say consumption stayed very strong. I thought consumption would drop dramatically in COVID. The opposite happened. The anchor point of 2019 before COVID, port volumes have grown almost 5% a year. So we're growing in the port industry. That's a commentary on our consumption. We've got a big trade imbalance. In fact, the GDP in the first quarter may be negative because we imported so much to avoid the tariffs. So imports are a big drag on GDP. Not surprisingly, we had record demand in 2022. Guess what? That spawned a big growth in industrial real estate, industrial development. Not surprising. So all that capacity is coming online in the last year and this year. So there's a lot of overcapacity today, but now the new building has come to a halt because of interest rates and sort of the overcapacity that's there. Savannah, my hometown, my competing port, is a notable outlier. So Savannah has 145 million square feet in industrial real estate. About 30 million of that is Hyundai. Hyundai is going in 1 year to where BMW was in 30 years, basically making 300,000 cars. And you see that they have almost 13 million square foot of industrial real estate, but the other warehouse segment is 10 million. So Savannah really focused on retail distribution. We were more manufacturing, and you see it in these numbers. And then in trucking, you know, we have a significant freight recession today. So,
may I add to that?
Yep.
And very briefly, I moved to Savannah in 2018. There were 60 million square feet of distribution center warehouse space. Almost none of that was Class A. And so we went from 60 million to 140 million. The forecast that I put together based on how Savannah was doing was that by 2030, we'd be at 195 million square feet. So if you X out, you know, remove the effect of the Hyundai plant, we are very much on track for that. So as the port volumes grow, so does the real estate. Now in Savannah, there was a gap when I got there. The gap is closed. Charleston has a gap. I'm working on it with a colleague at JLL, but you know, when I talk to the real estate guys, I go, well, maybe right not this very second, but honestly, long-term play-wise, South Carolina looks like a much better deal. Don't quote me on that because I live in Georgia. I don't want those guys to knock on my door and talk to me about it, but that's the way the numbers stack up.
So this focus a bit on the automotive industry, and this to me is kind of the biggest head scratcher and one of the biggest risks that we have. And I'll tell you why. So we consume between really 15 and 16 million cars a year, depending on interest rates. We're not consuming 20 million. There's no projections that we will grow like that. But yet, under the Biden administration, we invested about $180 billion in largely government-subsidized EV production. Half in the Southeast and half in the Midwest. It's roughly split. The problem is, again, we're not buying any new cars. So we added this capacity on top of the existing capacity. There are not a lot of new plants being closed, a lot of old plants being closed. I think we would agree demand for EVs is widely overstated. I use the electric Ford F-150 as one poster child for that. I don't know too many people in South Georgia buying electric F-150s to go hunting at 4 o'clock on Saturday morning. That doesn't really work out in the woods. So I think that's a problem. And so a lot of new capacity, relatively stable demand, and the states in the South, and we can name them, Toyota in North Carolina, we don't have to go through all of them, they're all involved. A lot of economic development money has been given for EV production. And I think we face a risk for the first time of some of these economic development projects failing. We don't have a history of that. We haven't had to claw back a lot of money from incentives. So there's something, I think it's a big risk. You know the conflict on power grids, on power demand. How do you pay road tax on an electric vehicle? That's got to be sorted out. And then very interesting, there's apparently a significant shift in consolidation in the offing in the automotive industry. I heard a guy from Stellantis say there'd be maximum 6 car companies left in the world. I think that's aggressive, but let's just say it's 10. I tried to do this well. It's impossible to come up with a reliable figure on who manufactures cars. So this is really an estimate or a swag or whatever you want. But if you look at this, China, all the different companies, I couldn't even keep up with them all. Certainly BYD is the one you hear about. Almost 17 million cars produced. China's the leader in EVs, by the way. You know, they do about 60% of the EV production. And everybody says, well, that's because they had some ecological brainwave. No, they just don't have any oil. They have to import oil. So they really want to build electric cars. But you see the normal suspects, the idea being that not all of these folks will be here in even 5 years' time. So that could be another pain point. So I think the developments of the automotive industry are central to the development of the economy in this country.
Just to support that point, Honda and Nissan are going to merge, so you can already take one of those off of his list. And he put this together before the announcement was made, just so you know. It was a very good call.
So I focus a lot on what our Treasury Secretary says. Scott Bessent's from Charleston. I didn't know him. Maybe some of you did, but he's extremely qualified. He's not an academic, no disrespect to academics. He's 35 years in the hedge fund industry. He is a conservative that started his career working for the most liberal guy in the hedge fund industry, George Soros. So he's obviously got some interesting background. You got to remember, we have predicted 10 of the last 2 recessions. We're recession crazy. We always predict recessions. And they haven't really materialized. But if you listen carefully to what he has said, I think this is the most important thing to end on before a few questions. Our major concern is $36 trillion in outstanding debt. We have $36 trillion in outstanding debt. We have a $2 trillion gap each year in our current account, revenue versus expense. $5 trillion in revenue, government, $7 trillion expense. That was under $5 trillion 5 years ago. So we have blown out the government spending side, and that's really how our economy grew in terms of employment growth and things of that nature. It's all government. So Bessent talks about detoxing the U.S. economy and going from a government-centered growth to a private sector-centered growth. And the problem is very little of this is discretionary. I think about 2/3 of this is entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So you ain't going to change that, right? So I think I saw a statistic. You could shut down every department in the federal government, and you would impact less than half of the deficit per year. So it's really not about the number of people working in the government. It's far more complicated than that. Bessent's idea is the only way that we're ever going to get out of this is to grow above the market. And all these strategies are centered around bringing growth back to the U.S., more manufacturing, more competitiveness, things of that nature. So it's called 3-3-3. We've got to grow 3% or more in GDP. We've got to reduce our deficit from 6 to 3% of GDP. And we've got to increase oil drilling by, and that shouldn't be $3 million, it should be 3 million barrels. So growth is the only way out of it. And some of the problems that we deal with are these sort of policy non sequiturs, right? So we want to grow manufacturing, but we have no workforce to grow manufacturing. So how do you do that? Well, you have to have legal immigration, which is a political third rail today. You can't even talk about it. I mean, ask Lindsey Graham about it, his third rail can't even talk about it. But we're going to have that if we're going to grow our economy. And what's interesting, the statistics show that since 2020, 70% of the new job creation in this country has been done through immigration. Don't know if it's legal or illegal. It is a combination of both.
Yeah, it is a
But it is a fact of life. So we've got to have immigration. So we've got our work cut out for us. I think
Before you summarize, just because this is not a trivial point that Jim's making, and one of the problems with the immigration is there's this incorrect assumption that when the immigrants come here, if they had like families of 3 and 4 kids, they're going to continue to do so. No, all the studies show in Europe, in the US, anywhere, when the immigrants come in, maybe they have 3 or 4 kids, they have a few more just to get their roots in, but their kids will only have 1.4 kids like any other American. They're not immigrants anymore, they're Americans, and they do like everybody else. Same in Germany, France, England. So you have to have a very dynamic immigrant policy if you're going to make this work. It's very complicated. You need to always be bringing more immigrants in and not assuming that the new guys who come in will feed you for several years. So it's not such a simple thing.
So just in summary, I really believe we're living in 2 countries today, the prosperous South and the languishing North. The North is losing population. They've got public sector pensions to pay for with a declining population. I think they have a real problem that's going to be an issue for our country. We're in this noisy adjustment period of less government stimulus and more private sector growth, and given that most economic indicators are lagging, that noise is going to last really through the whole year. I think I'm an optimist. I think these sharp trade elbows, all this nonsense every day is going to come eventually to a U.S.-China bilateral trade deal. That's what it has to be. Mm-hmm. If China invades Taiwan, all bets are off. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Just throw all this away because we're in a new world at that point. Government spending is clearly up. That's got to be brought under control. It's up just 7% in the 5 months of this fiscal year versus last fiscal year. So we're still spending way too much money. Got to get the U.S. debt under control. I think you got to watch the automotive industry as a barometer, and I think there'll be some pain there. And the barometer for success, if you learned anything from this election, it's not that anybody loved one candidate or the others. The middle class is pissed off. I've got 2 educators, daughter and son-in-law. They work hard. They don't make enough money with 2 kids to live on their own the way they want to live it, and they're mad about it. So this same thing can backfire on the current administration if they don't solve these problems. And I think we've got to have some policy consistency. You can't reshore jobs if you don't have workforce and things that are fairly obvious like that.